Deep in Zambia, buried under layers of sediment beside a waterfall called Kalambo Falls, archaeologists found two pieces of wood. Just wood. Nothing that should have survived. Wood rots. Wood decomposes. Wood becomes soil within decades, maybe a century if you're lucky. That's just how nature works, except these pieces of wood didn't rot away. They're still here, and when scientists finally dated them, the number that came back didn't make any sense at all. 476,000 years old. Read that again. Not 47,600. Not 4,760. 476,000 years old. That's not just older than the pyramids. That's not just older than agriculture or cities or writing. That's older than our own species. Homo sapiens, modern humans like you and me, we've only existed for about 300,000 years. This piece of wood predates us by nearly 200,000 years. And here's where it gets really strange. This wasn't just a random log or a fallen branch. When researchers examined it closely, they found cut marks, deliberate notches, two logs interlocked together, shaped by something with intention, with purpose, with a plan. It looked like the foundation of a structure, maybe a platform, maybe a walkway, maybe the base of a shelter. Nobody's entirely sure yet what it was for, but one thing is crystal clear. Somebody built this. Somebody chose these logs, shaped them, and joined them together in a way that required thinking ahead, planning, maybe even working together with others. So, here's the question that should stop you in your tracks. If modern humans didn't exist yet, who on earth built this? We're talking about a time before Homo sapiens walked the planet. A time we usually picture as brutal, animalistic, driven purely by survival instinct. Cavemen swinging clubs, grunting at each other, barely scraping by. That's the image most of us grew up with, but whoever made this structure wasn't just surviving. They were building, constructing, engineering, in the most basic sense of the word. And that changes everything we thought we knew about how early human technology actually developed. This discovery doesn't just add a footnote to history books. It rewrites entire chapters. It forces us to ask whether intelligence, planning, and craftsmanship existed far earlier and in far different hands than we ever imagined. Before we go further into the evidence, the dating methods, and the wild theories about who actually built this thing, if you're listening to this late at night, or maybe on a morning walk, or during your commute somewhere across the world, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is right now for you. I read through comments, and it's honestly wild seeing something like Reykjavik at midnight and Sydney at sunrise, all listening to the same story at the exact same moment. And if you enjoy listening without ads, without music breaking up the narration, just calm, clean storytelling to fall asleep to or drift off with, I've got a Spotify channel set up exactly for that. Following there costs nothing, and it genuinely helps support what I do here. So consider giving it a follow if that sounds like your kind of listening experience. Now, let's go back to the moment this wooden structure was first uncovered, and the researchers who almost couldn't believe what they were looking at. To understand how strange this discovery really is, you have to understand the place where it happened. Kalambo Falls sits right on the border between Zambia and Tanzania, where the Kalambo River suddenly drops over a cliff face, nearly twice the height of Niagara Falls. It's a dramatic, thundering wall of water, the kind of place that feels almost mythical just to stand near. But long before anyone cared about the waterfall's beauty, archaeologists cared about what was buried in the sediment below it. This site has been on the radar of scientists since the 1950s. Researchers had been pulling stone tools out of these layers for decades, hand axes, cleavers, scrapers, the kind of artifacts you'd expect from early human ancestors living near a reliable water source. Kalambo Falls became known as one of the richest Stone Age sites on the entire African continent. Generation after generation of archaeologists passed through, each one adding a little more to the picture of who lived here and when. But for all those decades of digging, nobody expected wood. Stone survives. Stone is built for the long haul. Wood is not. Wood is exactly the kind of material that archaeology usually loses forever. So for over half a century, the story of Kalambo Falls was a story told almost entirely through stone. Then in 2019, everything changed. A team led by archaeologists from the University of Liverpool returned to the site, part of an ongoing project trying to understand the deeper history buried in these riverbanks. They were excavating carefully, layer by layer, the way you do when you're working somewhere this significant, and buried deep in waterlogged sediment that had been sitting undisturbed for hundreds of thousands of years, they found something that made them stop completely. 2 pieces of wood, interlocked, not scattered randomly the way a fallen branch or a flood-swept log would be. These pieces had a notch cut into one of them, shaped so the second log could fit snugly on top, forming a joint. A deliberate, engineered connection. Picture the moment. You're an archaeologist standing in a muddy trench, brushing away sediment that hasn't seen daylight in longer than your species has existed, and you realise you're not looking at a natural formation. You're looking at carpentry, actual woodworking, hidden underground since long before Homo sapiens ever took a single breath. The researchers reportedly weren't sure at first what they'd stumbled onto. Wood this old simply isn't supposed to exist, let alone wood that's been shaped and joined together with what looks like intention. It defied everything the archaeological record had trained them to expect. And that uncertainty, that sense of standing in front of something the textbooks had no explanation for, is exactly why this discovery was treated as extraordinary from the very first moment someone brushed away the mud and saw those interlocking logs staring back at them. The person standing in that muddy trench, the one brushing away sediment that hadn't seen daylight in 500,000 years, was Professor Larry Barham. Barham is an archaeologist at the University of Liverpool, and he's not some newcomer stumbling onto a lucky find. He's been working at Kalambo Falls for years. He knows this site intimately, the way a mechanic knows an engine, the way a musician knows their instrument. He'd walked those riverbanks, mapped those layers, pulled countless stone tools from the dirt. He understood the deep history of this place better than almost anyone alive. And that expertise is exactly what made this discovery possible, because you don't find something that contradicts everything you thought you knew unless you're actually looking carefully enough to recognize it when it appears. Barham leads what's called the Deep Roots of Humanity project, and the name tells you something about the ambition behind this work. This isn't a small team of local researchers poking around in a single trench. This is a massive international collaboration, multidisciplinary in the truest sense of the word. You've got archaeologists from Liverpool working alongside geologists who understand the ancient river systems. You've got specialists in ancient plant remains analysing the sediments. You've got experts in soil formation trying to reconstruct exactly how these layers built up over hundreds of thousands of years. The project pulled in researchers from across the globe, each one bringing a different piece of the puzzle, because the question they were trying to answer wasn't simple. They weren't just asking who lived at Kalambo Falls. They were asking how deep human technology really goes. How far back can we trace the moment when our ancestors stopped just using whatever nature provided and started actually shaping the world around them with intention? And finding that answer meant working in conditions that would make most people quit after a single day. The excavation at Kalambo Falls isn't your standard dry site archaeology, where you're carefully sweeping dust off stone tools in a comfortable desert environment. This is waterlogged sediment. The stuff they're digging through is wet, heavy, clingy. It sticks to everything. Your trowel, your hands, your boots, your clothes. You're working in a swampy, muddy environment right next to a thundering waterfall, dealing with layers of earth that have been sitting in water for longer than our species has existed. Every movement has to be precise. Every tool has to be chosen carefully. You can't just hack into this sediment with a shovel because you might destroy something that's been preserved for hundreds of thousands of years. You have to work slowly, methodically, inch by inch, documenting everything as you go. And then there's the wood itself. If you think finding ancient wood is difficult, try preserving it once you've pulled it out of the ground. Wood that's been sitting in waterlogged sediment for millennia stays preserved because it's in a stable environment. No oxygen, no fluctuations in temperature or moisture, just constant conditions that prevent decay. The moment you expose that wood to air, the countdown starts. Oxygen rushes in, microbes wake up. The cellular structure that's been frozen in time begins to break down almost immediately. You've got hours, maybe days, before a piece of wood that survived for 500,000 years starts crumbling into dust in your hands. So the team had to develop elaborate preservation protocols on the spot. They had to keep the wood wet, protect it from light, stabilize it chemically, all while still trying to document and analyze what they'd found. It's like performing surgery on a patient who's been in a coma for 500,000 years, and you have to keep them alive long enough to figure out what made them so special in the first place. But here's where the story shifts from technical challenge to genuine human drama. Because in the middle of all this painstaking, exhausting, meticulous work, something happened that changed the entire project. Barham and his team were carefully excavating through those waterlogged layers, documenting everything, moving slow, when they started noticing something odd about the wood they were uncovering. At first, in the chaos of excavation, in the urgency of trying to preserve these impossibly ancient fragments, it was hard to tell what was significant and what was just natural variation. Wood gets shaped by water. River currents push logs around. Floods jam branches together. Animals trample and break things. The natural world is full of forces that can make wood look worked, look modified, look almost intentional, even when no human hand ever touched it. So the researchers were cautious. They had to be. You don't announce that you found the oldest wooden structure on Earth unless you're absolutely certain you're not looking at a natural formation. They examined the wood from every angle. They photographed it, measured it, traced the contours of every cut and notch. And slowly, carefully, the realization settled in. These logs weren't shaped by water. They weren't jammed together by floods. The notch cut into that first piece of wood, the carved depression that allowed the second log to sit snugly on top, was deliberate. Someone had made that notch. Someone had shaped that joint. Someone, 500,000 years ago, had looked at two pieces of wood and figured out how to connect them in a way that would hold. Picture that moment of realization for the team. You're already dealing with the shock of finding preserved wood at all, something that shouldn't exist, something that defies everything you've been taught about archaeological preservation. And then you realize the wood isn't just preserved. It's engineered. You're holding evidence of construction, of carpentry, of deliberate technological creation from a time period when no one thought any human ancestor was capable of anything like this. The textbooks said this kind of technology appeared hundreds of thousands of years later. The consensus said the minds capable of this kind of planning and execution didn't exist yet, and you're standing there in the mud, looking at proof that the consensus was wrong. That moment changed everything about how the project operated. Because once you realize you found intentionally shaped wood from 500,000 years ago, the questions multiply exponentially. You need to know exactly how old this is. Not roughly, not approximately, not within a broad archaeological time range. You need precision. You need dates that can stand up to the scrutiny of every skeptical scientist who's going to look at this find and ask how you can possibly claim that something this sophisticated exists at this time period. And that meant Barham needed help from a completely different kind of specialist. The excavation team had done their part. They'd found the wood, recognized its significance, preserved it, documented it. Now they needed dating specialists, scientists who could take those ancient sediments and those carefully preserved wooden fragments and pin them down to a specific moment in deep time. The collaboration that followed would bring in experts from entirely different fields, people who didn't know archaeology but knew the physics and chemistry of ancient materials, people who could read time itself written in mineral deposits and radioactive isotopes. Here's the problem. You've just found the oldest wooden structure on Earth, something that rewrites human history, and you need to prove when it was built. But the material you're working with, wood, is basically the worst candidate possible for traditional dating methods. Radiocarbon dating, the technique that revolutionized archaeology and gave us precise dates for countless ancient sites, works by measuring the decay of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope that accumulates in living organisms. When an organism dies, whether it's a tree or a human or a mammoth, the carbon-14 starts breaking down at a known rate. By measuring how much is left, scientists can calculate how long ago that organism died. It's elegant, precise, and for anything up to about 50,000 years old, incredibly reliable, but beyond 50,000 years, radiocarbon dating hits a wall. Carbon-14 decays relatively quickly. After 50 millennia, there's simply not enough left to measure accurately. The signal gets lost in the noise, swamped by background radiation and contamination. You're trying to read a message that's been erased by time itself. So when Barham's team looked at those ancient logs from Kalambo Falls, they knew immediately that radiocarbon was useless. If this wood was even remotely as old as they suspected, it was far beyond the reach of carbon dating. They needed a completely different approach. They needed a method that could reach deeper into time, past the 50,000-year barrier, past the 100,000-year barrier, into territory where radiocarbon simply cannot operate. That method was luminescence dating. And understanding how it works requires a brief dive into physics that's worth taking, because it reveals something remarkable about the world around us. Luminescence dating doesn't measure the wood itself. It measures the sediment surrounding it, the sand and silt and mineral grains that buried those logs hundreds of thousands of years ago. And it works because of something most people never think about. Mineral grains are constantly absorbing radiation from their environment. There's radiation in the soil itself, coming from trace amounts of radioactive elements like uranium, thorium, and potassium. There's radiation from cosmic rays bombarding the Earth from space. All of this radiation is hitting those mineral grains constantly, every second, every minute, every day, and it's doing something specific. It's knocking electrons out of their normal positions in the crystal structure of those grains. Those displaced electrons don't just float away. They get trapped in defects and imperfections within the crystal lattice, little structural flaws that act like pockets, catching and holding electrons that have been knocked loose by radiation. Think of it like a jar slowly filling with water. Every drop of radiation adds more trapped electrons. Over time, more and more electrons accumulate in those traps, building up a kind of stored energy, a latent signal that's waiting to be released. Now, here's the crucial part. Those trapped electrons can be released by light. When a mineral grain is exposed to sunlight, specifically to ultraviolet and visible light, the energy from that light knocks the trapped electrons back out of their crystal pockets. The electrons escape, and as they do, they release energy in the form of photons. The grain literally glows. This is luminescence. And once those electrons have been released, the jar is empty again. The stored signal has been reset to zero. This means that any mineral grain that's been sitting on the surface of the Earth, exposed to sunlight, has its luminescent signal constantly reset. Every day the sun comes up, it empties the jar. But the moment that grain gets buried, the moment it's covered by sediment and shielded from sunlight, everything changes. The jar starts filling again. Radiation from the soil and cosmic rays starts trapping electrons in those crystal defects. The luminescent signal begins accumulating steadily, predictably, at a rate determined by the local radiation environment. And it keeps accumulating for as long as the grain remains buried, which could be thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, even millions. When archaeologists want to date ancient sediment, they collect samples in complete darkness. No exposure to light at all. They transport them in opaque containers, handle them in dark rooms, because even a few seconds of sunlight could reset the signal and destroy the information they're trying to extract. Then in the laboratory, they carefully heat those mineral grains or shine specific wavelengths of light on them under controlled conditions. This releases the trapped electrons and produces a measurable luminescent signal. The strength of that signal tells them how many electrons have accumulated since the grain was last exposed to sunlight. And since they can measure the local radiation rate, the rate at which electrons are being trapped per year, they can calculate how long the grain has been buried. It's like finding a jar that's been slowly filling with water and knowing the rate at which water was added. You can calculate exactly how long the jar has been sitting there. This was the technique that Barham's team needed, and they brought in specialists who understood it intimately. Researchers who had spent years refining luminescence methods, calibrating instruments, developing protocols that could extract reliable dates from sediments hundreds of thousands of years old. The team collected samples from the layers surrounding those wooden structures, the sediment that had buried and preserved the logs. They took multiple samples from different depths and positions, creating a three-dimensional picture of the sedimentary history at Kalambo Falls. They analysed mineral grains, measured radiation rates, calculated trapped electron populations, and then they ran the numbers. The results were staggering. The sediment surrounding those carved, notched logs had been buried approximately 476,000 years ago. Not 50,000 years, not 100,000 years, not even 200,000 years, nearly 500,000 years. This was a date that pushed the find beyond the reach of conventional archaeological expectations in every possible sense. Most models of human technological evolution place the development of complex construction, of deliberate carpentry, of structural engineering, anywhere from 50,000 to maybe 100,000 years ago. Some generous interpretations might push it back to 200,000. But 476,000, that wasn't just pushing the boundary. That was demolishing it entirely. That was taking everything archaeologists thought they knew about the timeline of human cognitive and technological development and throwing it into question. And this is where scientific caution becomes absolutely essential. Because a date this extraordinary demands extraordinary scrutiny. Luminescence dating, like any scientific method, has uncertainties and potential sources of error. The local radiation environment might vary over time. Sediment might get mixed up by water movement or animal activity. Mineral grains might not have been fully bleached by sunlight before burial, leaving a residual signal that makes the date appear older than it actually is. The researchers had to account for all of these possibilities. They ran multiple analyses, cross-checked their results, tested their assumptions rigorously, and the date held up. Approximately 476,000 years. With some margin of uncertainty, yes, but even accounting for that margin, this wooden structure was undeniably ancient, undeniably older than anything like it had ever been found before, undeniably older than most scientists thought possible. The implications were profound. Someone, something, had engineered this structure nearly 500,000 years ago. And now the question that would dominate everything that followed became unavoidable. So we have a date, nearly 500,000 years. We have wood, preserved against all odds by the relentless water and sediment of Kalambo Falls. But a date is just a number. Wood is just wood. To understand why this discovery shook the foundations of what we thought we knew about human evolution, you need to look at what they actually found down there. You need to examine the anatomy of the structure itself. Because this wasn't just a pile of fallen timber. This wasn't a couple of logs that happened to tumble into a riverbed and settle on top of each other. This was something fundamentally different. Something that, when you break it down to its core components, reveals a kind of thinking that shouldn't have existed 476,000 years ago. Picture the scene as the researchers carefully excavated through the ancient sediment, brushing away 500,000 years of accumulated mud and sand. What emerged were two logs, two substantial pieces of timber, each roughly the size and shape of a mature tree branch. But it wasn't their size that stopped the team in their tracks. It was their relationship to each other. These two logs were interlocking. They were physically joined together in a way that defied any explanation involving gravity, water flow, or random chance. One of the logs had a notch cut into it, a deliberate, intentional, carved-out section where the wood had been removed to create a specific shape. A shape that was clearly designed to accommodate the other log. The second log rested inside that notch, fitting into the carved gap like a puzzle piece snapping into place. The fit wasn't rough or approximate. The dimensions of the notch corresponded to the dimensions of the log it held. This was an interface, a mechanical connection designed to join two separate pieces of wood into a single, stable unit. Think about what that actually means. A notch isn't something that happens by accident. You don't get a precise, shaped cavity in a hardwood log through erosion, rot, or animal activity. You don't get a complementary piece of timber that just happens to slot perfectly into that cavity because it fell from a tree upstream. The notch was created. It was carved. It was removed from the surrounding wood through deliberate, repeated action. And it was shaped for a purpose. That purpose was to hold the other log in place, to prevent it from rolling away, to create a structural joint that could bear weight, resist movement, and maintain its integrity over time. This is joinery. This is the fundamental principle of carpentry. Take two separate elements, modify at least one of them, so they fit together, and combine them into something larger and more stable than either could be alone. It's the same basic concept that underlies everything from a simple log cabin to the framing of a modern skyscraper. Cut a notch, fit a beam, lock it in place. The technique is so universal, so deeply embedded in human construction that we barely think about it. It's just how you build things with wood, except 476,000 years ago. Nobody was supposed to be building things with wood. Nobody was supposed to have the cognitive capacity to conceive of, plan, and execute a structural joint. And the evidence gets even more compelling when you look closer. The surface of the wood, the areas around the notch and along the logs, showed something that made the archaeologists' hearts race. Tool marks, visible, identifiable marks left by the implements used to carve that notch and shape that wood. These weren't vague scratches that could be attributed to natural abrasion. They were concentrated, patterned gouges and cuts consistent with stone tool use. You can almost picture the hands that made them. Someone, something, gripping a piece of shaped stone, striking the wood repeatedly, chipping away the material inside that notch, carving out the space for the other log to fit. Each mark is a record of a single action, a single strike, a single moment of intentional modification. When you compare this find to what natural log arrangements look like, the difference is stark and unambiguous. In nature, fallen trees accumulate in what geomorphologists call log jams, random piles of timber pushed together by floods, stacked by gravity, tangled by water currents. They overlap, they press against each other, they form chaotic heaps. But they don't interlock. They don't have notches carved to accommodate adjacent pieces. They don't show tool marks on their surfaces. Natural arrangements are defined by disorder, by the physics of falling and settling. The Kalambo structure is defined by order, by design, by the imposition of human or hominin intention onto raw material. The researchers considered every alternative explanation. Could water erosion have created that notch? No. Water erosion produces smooth, rounded surfaces, gradual wearing away of material. The notch showed sharp internal angles and flat surfaces consistent with carving. Could the logs have settled into that position naturally, one accidentally resting in a natural depression on the other? No. The notch was too regular, too specific in its dimensions, and the fit between the two logs was too precise for coincidence. Could animal activity, insects or burrowing creatures, have created the cavity? No, insect damage creates tunnels and galleries, irregular channels following grain patterns. This was a wide, open, deliberate notch, designed to hold another piece of wood at a right angle. One by one, the alternative explanations fell away. Every natural process that could potentially create something resembling this configuration failed to account for the specific characteristics observed: the notch, the fit, the tool marks, the interlocking geometry. The only explanation that accounted for all the evidence was the one that initially seemed the most extraordinary: purposeful construction, deliberate modification, intentional design. Someone, nearly 500,000 years ago, selected these logs, picked up a tool, carved a notch, and fitted them together. They built something, and that simple act, that basic modification of raw material to serve a structural purpose, carries implications that reach far beyond the banks of the Kalambo River. Because carving a notch isn't just a physical action. It's a cognitive one. It requires a kind of thinking that operates across time. You have to envision the finished joint before you start carving. You have to understand that removing wood from one log will create a space that another log can occupy. You have to anticipate the result of your actions before you take them. This is what psychologists call prospective cognition, the ability to plan for a future state that doesn't yet exist, to hold a mental image of a desired outcome, and then execute a sequence of actions to bring that outcome into reality. It's the same cognitive capacity that lets a modern carpenter look at a pile of lumber and see a house, or lets an engineer look at a block of metal and see a machine. The raw materials don't contain the structure. The structure exists first in the mind of the builder. Then, through deliberate action, it's imposed onto the materials. The logs at Kalambo Falls show us that this kind of thinking, this ability to project a mental blueprint onto the physical world, existed 476,000 years ago. Not 50,000 years ago, not 100,000 years ago. Not in the minds of modern humans or even Neanderthals. In the minds of something else entirely, something that wasn't us. So we have a structure, we have interlocking logs, a carved notch, tool marks, and a date that pins this achievement to nearly 500,000 years ago. We have evidence of prospective cognition, of minds that could envision a future state and physically bring it into reality. But this immediately plunges us into a staggering problem, a contradiction so sharp it nearly breaks the narrative of human progress that we've been telling ourselves for generations. Because to ask who built this, you first have to ask who was even around to build it. And when you lay out the human evolutionary timeline around 476,000 years ago, the answer is deeply uncomfortable for anyone raised on the traditional story of our species' inevitable march toward brilliance. Let me paint the picture for you. 500,000 years ago, the world was not ours. It wasn't even close to being ours. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, the species that would eventually paint the caves of Lascaux, invent agriculture and split the atom, did not exist. We hadn't emerged yet. Our lineage was still deep in the furnace of evolution, still being forged by the brutal selective pressures of the post-bottleneck world. The first tentative stirrings of what would eventually become our species were still hundreds of thousands of years away. If you had been dropped into the African landscape 500,000 years ago and looked around for the people who would one day build skyscrapers and space stations, you wouldn't find them. They simply weren't there yet. This is the timeline problem, and it's enormous. For decades, the default assumption in archaeology has been that complex construction, deliberate engineering, the kind of prospective cognition required to plan and execute a structural joint, was the exclusive domain of our species. It was our special ingredient, our defining feature. When we found evidence of sophisticated behavior, we assumed it was us. When we found structures, we assumed they were built by hands like ours, guided by minds like ours. The entire framework of human cognitive evolution has been built around the idea that something like modern human intelligence was the prerequisite for this kind of achievement. That you needed our brains, our language capacity, our social complexity, to conceive of and execute something like the Kalambo structure. But 476,000 years ago, those brains didn't exist. Those minds weren't on the scene. So whose mind was? This is where the picture gets wonderfully complicated, and where the story we've been telling ourselves starts to fray at the edges. Because 500,000 years ago, the human family tree wasn't a single trunk leading straight up to us. It was a branching, tangled bush with multiple species living at the same time, sometimes in the same regions, all adapting to their own specific challenges, all walking their own evolutionary paths. The concept of a linear progression from primitive to modern, from simple to complex, with one species neatly handing the baton to the next, is a myth. Evolution doesn't work that way. It's messy, it's parallel, it's full of experiments, and dead ends and unexpected innovations. Around 500,000 years ago, Africa and Eurasia were home to multiple contemporaneous hominin species. You had Homo erectus, the ancient wanderer who had spread across vast territories and persisted for an astonishingly long time, though by this era their numbers were likely dwindling, their lineage fading into the background. You had the ancestors of the Neanderthals, populations moving north and west, adapting to the cold, beginning the long evolutionary journey that would eventually produce the robust, ice-hardened hunters of Europe. You had the ancestors of the Denisovans moving east, spreading across Asia, developing their own unique adaptations to diverse and challenging environments. And you had something else, something that was evolving in Africa from the survivors of that devastating bottleneck. Something that wasn't any of these groups, but was becoming something new. For some researchers, this timing initially seemed implausible. Not because the dating was wrong, the methodology was solid, and the results clear, but because the implications violated a deeply held assumption about the trajectory of human cognitive evolution. The assumption that big, revolutionary leaps in intelligence and capability happened late, happened with us, happened in the minds of anatomically modern humans after we emerged as a distinct species roughly 300,000 years ago. The idea that someone, something, was doing carpentry nearly 500,000 years ago felt like a chronological impossibility, like finding a printing press in a Roman villa or a telescope in a medieval monastery. It didn't fit the pattern, it didn't fit the story. It suggested that the story itself might be wrong, because the significance of construction predating anatomically modern humans by nearly 200,000 years is staggering. It means that the cognitive capacities required for this kind of work, the prospective cognition, the ability to mentally model a structure before building it, the understanding of mechanical principles like interlocking and load-bearing, the capacity to select appropriate raw materials and modify them with precision existed before our species ever walked the earth. These weren't human abilities in the narrow sense of the word. They weren't Homo sapiens abilities. They were something older, something deeper, something that was present in the minds of whatever hominin stood beside the Kalambo River with a stone tool in their hand and a vision of interlocking logs in their imagination. This is the central question that the rest of this story will explore. Not just what the structure was for, though that question matters deeply. Not just how it was built, though the mechanics of its construction reveal remarkable sophistication. But who? Who stood beside that river? Who selected those logs? Who carved that notch? Who held the mental blueprint that preceded the physical structure? Who, nearly 500,000 years ago, possessed the kind of mind that could look at raw, unshaped timber and see the possibility of a joint, a connection, a construction? The answer isn't simple, it isn't clean, and it might just rewrite everything we thought we knew about the origins of human intelligence. Because whoever they weren't us, but they were thinking like us, or at least thinking in ways that we've always claimed were uniquely ours. And that raises a question far more profound than any single archaeological discovery. If the kind of cognition required to build this structure existed 476,000 years ago, in minds that weren't modern human minds, then what exactly is the relationship between our species and our intelligence? Are we the source of this kind of thinking, or merely its inheritors? Did we create this cognitive capacity, or did we receive it from something that came before us, something that figured out how to plan, how to design, how to build, long before we ever existed? To answer that, we need to look at the candidates. We need to examine the hominins who are actually present in that landscape, at that time, with that opportunity. We need to look at what we know about their capabilities, their toolkits, their environments. And we need to be honest about what we don't know, about the vast gaps in the fossil record, the fragmentary nature of our evidence, the enormous uncertainty that surrounds any attempt to peer this far back into the minds of creatures who left no writing, no art, no explicit record of their thoughts. They left only what they made, and what they made at Kalambo Falls is speaking to us across 500,000 years, telling us something we never expected to hear, that someone, back then, was capable of far more than we ever imagined. So let's meet the suspects. When you're investigating a crime scene from 500,000 years ago, you don't have fingerprints or security cameras. You have fossils, stone tools, and a lot of educated deduction. And right now, the leading suspect, the one standing in the interrogation room with the most evidence pointing in their direction, is a species that might just be the most underrated figure in the entire human family tree. Homo heidelbergensis. If you've never heard of heidelbergensis, you're not alone. They don't get the spotlight like Neanderthals or the dramatic origin story of Homo sapiens, but they might deserve more credit than we've ever given them. Heidelbergensis lived roughly between 700,000 and 200,000 years ago, straddling that critical period when human cognition was supposedly still stuck in the primitive mud. They were widespread, with populations across Africa and Europe, and they were physically impressive. Their brain sizes ranged from about 1,100 to 1,400 cubic centimeters. That's not just large, that's overlapping with the lower end of modern human brain volume. These weren't small-minded creatures fumbling through existence. They were big-bodied, big-brained hominins walking the African landscape during exactly the time frame the Kalambo structure was built. But brain size alone doesn't build interlocking log structures. You need the behavioral evidence, the proof that these minds could do more than just survive. You need to know if they could plan, if they could coordinate, if they could look at a piece of wood and see the potential for a notch that would hold two pieces together under pressure. And here's where the case for heidelbergensis gets genuinely compelling, because at a site called Schöningen in Germany, roughly 300,000 years ago, archaeologists found something that shattered the old narrative about these beings. They found wooden throwing spears, not just sharpened sticks. Carefully crafted, balanced projectile weapons made from spruce, with tips carved from the densest part of the tree trunk and shafts shaped from the lighter, more flexible wood near the surface. These spears were engineered. The makers understood the properties of different parts of the wood. They selected specific materials for specific functions. They weighted the front ends for aerodynamic stability, designing weapons that could be thrown accurately at high velocity to bring down fast-moving prey like horses. Think about what that implies. To make a Schöningen spear, you need perspective cognition. You need to visualize the finished weapon before you start carving. You need to understand how wood behaves when it flies through the air. You need to coordinate a hunting strategy that requires multiple individuals throwing these weapons simultaneously. And you need to transmit that complex knowledge across generations, because this kind of engineering doesn't just spring from one genius mind in isolation. It's a cultural tradition, a learned skill, a shared technology. If heidelbergensis could do this in Germany 300,000 years ago, could they have done something even more ambitious 476,000 years ago in Africa? The Kalambo structure would represent a further leap. Yes. But it's not a leap from zero. It's a leap from a baseline of sophisticated woodworking that we already know they possessed. It's a leap from minds that had already proven they could select, modify, and engineer wooden objects with clear functional purposes. But here's where the uncertainty creeps in, because the human family tree is never simple. Heidelbergensis might be the leading candidate, but they weren't the only hominins walking the African landscape during this period. You had late populations of Homo erectus, that ancient wanderer who had persisted for well over 1 million years. By 500,000 years ago, erectus was likely in its twilight phase, their numbers dwindling, their lineage fading. But fading doesn't mean vanished. Some populations could have still been present in various regions, still making tools, still adapting to local environments, still capable of behaviours we might underestimate because of our tendency to view older species as inherently less capable. And then there's the wild card, the possibility that catches everyone off guard. Homo naledi. Naledi was discovered in South Africa and initially dated to a surprisingly recent period, potentially overlapping with this time frame. They had small brains, roughly half the size of a modern human's brains, that by traditional measures should have placed them firmly in the incapable category. But Naledi's behaviour suggested something different. The way their remains were found in deep, complex cave systems raised controversial questions about whether they might have engaged in deliberate body disposal, a behaviour that requires sophisticated spatial navigation and possibly social coordination. If Naledi or similar small-brained hominins were present in the broader African landscape during this period, they force us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. Is brain size really the reliable proxy for cognitive capability we've always assumed it to be? Could a species with a brain significantly smaller than ours still possess the prospective cognition required to plan and execute a wooden structure? It's a possibility that most researchers view with deep skepticism, but it's a possibility that the Kalambo discovery forces onto the table. The honest, unvarnished truth is that we cannot pin this achievement on a specific species with certainty, because here's the critical gap in the evidence. At Kalambo Falls itself, alongside the wooden structure and the stone tools, there are no hominin bones. No skulls, no teeth, no skeletal remains that could definitively tell us whose hands carved that notch. We have their work, we have their tools, we have the physical trace of their minds translated into material form. But we don't have their bodies. We can't look at the builder face to face. And this absence is enormous. It means that any attribution of the structure to heidelbergensis or erectus or any other candidate remains an interpretation, an informed deduction based on circumstantial evidence, not a settled fact stamped with scientific certainty. This is how science actually works in the deep past. Not with clean answers and definitive labels, but with probabilities and uncertainties and ongoing debate. Heidelbergensis remains the strongest candidate based on brain size, geographic presence, and demonstrated woodworking capability at sites like Schöningen. But strength of candidacy is not proof. It's a lead that detectives would call promising but insufficient for conviction. The question of who built the Kalambo structure is an open scientific question, a living inquiry, not a closed case. And keeping it open, resisting the urge to slap a species name on this achievement and move on, is crucial. Because the uncertainty itself is revealing. It tells us that our understanding of the human family tree during this period is still fragmentary, still evolving, still full of gaps that could contain surprises we haven't even imagined yet. The structure at Kalambo Falls was built by someone. Something with hands that could grip, eyes that could measure, and a mind that could plan. But exactly who that someone was, exactly what species name belongs in that blank, is a mystery that the archaeologists who found these logs are still working to solve. And maybe that's the most honest place to leave it for now, with the question still burning, still open, still demanding that we keep looking, keep thinking, keep pushing against the boundaries of what we thought we knew about the minds that walked this earth before ours ever existed. For over a century, we've told ourselves a story about human evolution that goes something like this. For millions of years, our ancestors were basically just clever animals. They banged rocks together, they scavenged meat, they huddled in caves, and they waited. They waited for the spark. They waited for that magical moment when some two-bent, some genetic lightning bolt finally upgraded their brains from primitive to modern. And only then, only after crossing that invisible cognitive threshold, did they become capable of real innovation. Planning, engineering, culture, everything before that moment was just survival. Everything after it was civilization. It's a comforting narrative. It puts us at the apex, the inevitable endpoint of a long, grinding march toward intelligence. But the Kalambo Falls structure takes that story and shakes it until it cracks. Because here's the problem. That narrative was built on an illusion created by the most unreliable witness in all of science. The archaeological record. We've been reconstructing the cognitive capabilities of ancient hominins based almost entirely on what survives in the dirt. And what survives? Stone, bone, sometimes ash, if the fire was hot enough. Stone tools are durable. They're practically indestructible. A hand axe dropped 500,000 years ago can sit in the ground through ice ages, floods, and continental shifts, and still look almost exactly like it did the day some hominin last gripped it. So when we dig up a site and find stone tools, we see clear, undeniable evidence of cognitive capability. We measure the precision of the flaking. We analyze the symmetry. We write papers about the planning depth required to produce such artifacts. And we conclude, reasonably enough, that these creatures had some degree of technical skill. But wood vanishes, it rots, it burns, it gets consumed by insects and fungi and bacteria. Within decades, sometimes within just a few years, a carved wooden object can disappear entirely from the landscape, leaving no trace that it ever existed. Unless, that is, it ends up in the right place. Underwater, buried in anaerobic mud, preserved by some freak combination of mineral saturation and constant moisture that freezes the decomposition process in its tracks. This is what happened at Kalambo Falls. Those logs survived because they were buried in waterlogged sediment that essentially pickled them for nearly 500,000 years. But this kind of preservation is rare, exceedingly rare. The vast majority of wooden artifacts ever created by human hands, by any hominin hands, have been lost forever. They existed, they were used, they were crafted with skill and intention, and then they returned to the earth without leaving a single whisper of their presence in the archaeological record. This creates what researchers call a preservation bias, a fundamental distortion in our evidence that skews our understanding of the past toward materials that happen to be durable and away from materials that happen to be perishable. And the implications of this bias are staggering. Because think about what wood would have meant to early hominins. They lived in environments full of trees. Wood was everywhere. It was the most abundant, most accessible, most versatile raw material available to them. You could use it for digging sticks, for throwing spears, for clubs and handles and wedges and traps. You could sharpen it into points. You could split it into planks. You could hollow it out into containers. And, as we now know beyond any doubt, you could notch it and interlock it and build structures with it. Wood would have been central to their daily lives, central to their technology, central to their survival strategies. And almost none of it survives. So what have we been doing for the last 100 years? We've been looking at the tiny fraction of technology that happens to preserve well the stone, and using it to reconstruct the entire cognitive landscape of our ancestors. We've been writing the history of human innovation based on a severely incomplete dataset. Imagine trying to understand modern human technology by only studying stainless steel. You'd see surgical instruments and kitchen knives and car parts. You'd conclude that modern humans are pretty good at metalworking. But you'd miss furniture, you'd miss clothing, you'd miss paper, plastic, rubber, electronics. You'd miss almost everything that actually defines daily life. That's essentially what we've been doing with ancient hominins. We've been studying their stone tools and concluding that they were basically simple tool users, because that's what the evidence shows. But the evidence is a fraction of the reality, a tiny, distorted, deeply misleading fraction. The old assumption went like this. If early hominins were really capable of complex woodworking, we'd find the evidence. We'd see wooden artifacts in the archaeological record the way we see stone ones. The absence of such evidence proves they lacked the capability. But this is a logical fallacy of the most dangerous kind. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's especially not evidence of absence when you're dealing with materials that almost universally decompose. The lack of wooden artifacts at most ancient sites doesn't tell us that hominins couldn't work with wood. It tells us that wood doesn't survive. Those are completely different statements, with completely different implications. The Kalambo discovery demolishes the old assumption, because now we have direct, physical, undeniable proof that someone 500,000 years ago was shaping logs, cutting notches, and building with wood. And if they were doing it at Kalambo Falls, they were almost certainly doing it elsewhere too. This wasn't a one-off anomaly, this was a technology, a practiced, deliberate, culturally transmitted skill. The precision of those notches, the deliberate selection and modification of those logs, the clear understanding of how wooden components could be fitted together to create something larger and more stable than any individual piece. This requires knowledge that is learned, refined, and shared. It doesn't emerge from a single genius working in isolation. It implies a tradition, a community of practice, a body of technical knowledge accumulated over generations. So, if woodworking was happening at Kalambo 476,000 years ago, how much earlier was it happening? How many hundreds of thousands of years before that moment were hominins already carving, shaping, and constructing with the most abundant material in their environment? We have no way of knowing because the evidence is gone, eaten by time, consumed by decay, returned to the soil and the water and the air. But the Kalambo structure gives us a glimpse through a rare window into that vanished world. And what we see through that window forces us to rethink everything we assumed about the minds that made it. We called them primitive. We assumed they were simple. We drew a line between their cognition and ours and placed them firmly on the far side, in the realm of instinct and basic problem solving, not planning and engineering and shared technical culture. But those notches in those logs tell a different story. They tell us that someone, long before our species existed, was thinking in ways we never credited them for. And that means the story of human intelligence is longer, richer, and more complex than we ever imagined. But the wood alone doesn't tell the whole story. You can't carve a notch into a log with your bare hands. You can't shape a timber, split a branch, or shave down a surface without something harder, something sharp, something that can bite into the grain and shear away the fibres you don't want. Whoever built the Kalambo structure needed tools, and they left them behind, scattered among those ancient logs, preserved in the same waterlogged sediment that kept the wood from rotting away to nothing. The researchers found stone tools, dozens of them, a literal toolkit sitting right next to the construction site, frozen in time for nearly 500,000 years. This is extraordinary. Usually when archaeologists find stone tools at an ancient site, they're looking at isolated artifacts, objects whose connection to any specific activity has been lost to the vast sweep of time. You find a hand axe, you date the sediment around it, you make some educated guesses about what it might have been used for. But at Kalambo, the tools weren't just in the same general layer. They were right there, directly associated with the wooden structure. The builders dropped them, or set them down, or discarded them after the work was done. And then the water rose, the mud settled, and everything was sealed together in a single moment of preservation that gives us a snapshot of a working construction site from 476,000 years ago. So what was in the toolkit? The answer takes us deep into the technological traditions of early hominins, and it reveals something crucial about the minds that built this structure. The stone tools found at Kalambo Falls belong to two distinct traditions that archaeologists have tracked across Africa and beyond for generations. The older tradition is called Oldowan, named after the site where it was first identified, Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. Oldowan tools represent the dawn of stone technology itself. They're simple, at least by later standards. Basic flakes chipped off larger rocks, crude choppers made by smashing one stone against another until a rough edge forms. But don't let the simplicity fool you. Oldowan technology was revolutionary. Before these tools, hominins had nothing but their hands and their teeth. Oldowan flakes gave them cutting edges, the ability to slice through hide and meat, to crack open bones for marrow, to process plants that would have been impossible to eat raw. This technology emerged roughly 2.6 million years ago, and it spread across Africa like wildfire, carried by hominin groups who recognized its immense value. For over 1 million years, Oldowan tools were the standard, the baseline, the foundation upon which all later technology would be built. Then something changed. Around 1.7 million years ago, a new tool tradition appeared, Acheulean. And if Oldowan was the opening chord of human technology, Acheulean was the first real symphony. The signature artifact of the Acheulean tradition is the hand axe, those elegant, tear-shaped stone tools that look almost like works of art when you see them in museum displays. But making a true Acheulean hand axe requires a completely different level of cognitive engagement than making an Oldowan chopper. You can't just bash rocks together and hope for the best. You have to plan. You have to visualize the finished tool before you start removing flakes. You have to understand the internal structure of the stone, how it will fracture along predictable lines if you strike it at just the right angle with just the right force. You have to maintain symmetry, thinning the edges evenly while preserving the mass at the center. And you have to do all of this in a sequence, a planned series of actions that build toward a predetermined goal. This is what archaeologists call a prepared core technique, and it represents a quantum leap in cognitive complexity. The maker isn't just reacting to the stone, they're imposing their will on it. They have an idea in their mind, and they're executing that idea through a controlled sequential process. At Kalambo, both traditions are present. Oldowan flakes and choppers sit alongside Acheulean hand axes and more refined cutting tools. This coexistence isn't unusual for Middle Pleistocene sites, but here it takes on a special significance. Because the tools aren't just sitting in the dirt. Some of them show direct physical evidence of the work they were doing. The researchers examined the wooden logs under microscopic analysis and found something that sent chills down their spines. Tool marks, cut marks, scarification patterns that could only have been made by stone edges striking the wood at specific angles with specific forces. And these marks match the known cutting patterns of Acheulean tools. The precision of the flaking on the stone matches the precision of the cutting on the wood. The angle of the blows matches the angle of the marks. The width of the stone edges matches the width of the cuts. This isn't circumstantial. This isn't an educated guess. This is direct physical evidence linking specific stone tools to specific wooden modifications. The same hands that shaped those Acheulean hand axes shaped those logs. The same minds that planned the sequence of flake removals planned the sequence of notch cuts. And if you want to go even deeper into the mysteries of ancient technology, the tool traditions that shaped our ancestors' world, and the incredible stories behind discoveries like this one, I want to give a quick shout out to the book Prehistoric Secrets, available over on sleepytimehistory.com. It covers exactly this kind of thing in rich, fascinating detail. And there's actually a discount this week, so it's a perfect time to grab a copy if you're hungry for more of these ancient revelations. Now, back to the site. Here's what makes the combination of tools at Kalambo so significant. It's not just that they exist, it's that they exist together. Oldowan and Acheulean, simple flake tools and sophisticated hand axes, heavy choppers for rough work and precision edges for fine cutting. This isn't a random assemblage. This is a working toolkit, a set of implements chosen and brought to the site for a specific purpose, construction. Think about what that implies. The builders weren't just picking up whatever rock happened to be nearby and hoping it would work. They were selecting appropriate tools for appropriate tasks. They understood that different jobs required different instruments. That crude force was good for some things, but that delicate precision was essential for others. This is exactly how modern craftsmen work. You don't use a sledgehammer to carve a notch, and you don't use a scalpel to split a log. The Kalambo Toolkit shows that whoever built this structure had the same fundamental understanding of tool application that any skilled worker has today. Different tools for different tasks. A complete, integrated technological system. And that system almost certainly extended far beyond what survived in the mud. Stone tools preserve. We have them. But what about the tools that don't preserve? What about the wooden mallets they might have used to drive joints together without crushing the fibres? What about the digging sticks they might have used to prepare the ground before setting the uprights? What about the cordage, the rope, the bindings made from plant fibres or animal sinew that might have held temporary scaffolding in place during construction? None of these things survive at Kalambo. They couldn't. They're made from perishable materials that decompose in decades, not millennia. But the logic of the construction demands their existence. You don't build a wooden structure with nothing but stone tools and bare hands. You use every material available to you. You create a complete toolkit, a full technological ecosystem, where stone, wood, fibre, and probably other materials we can't even guess at all work together to accomplish something that no single material could achieve alone. The stone tools we found are just the durable core of that ecosystem, the tip of a technological iceberg whose full dimensions are lost to time. But that loss, that vast missing dimension of our technological history, points us towards something even more fundamental. Something that makes the Kalambo discovery not just surprising, but almost miraculous. We need to talk about why we never find ancient wood. Not why it's rare, why it's basically non-existent in the archaeological record beyond a few thousand years. Because once you understand that, once you grasp just how relentlessly the natural world erases organic materials, the survival of these logs starts to look less like a lucky accident and more like a statistical impossibility that somehow happened anyway. The science of decomposition is brutally straightforward. Wood is food. It's stored energy, locked up in complex molecular chains like cellulose and lignin, that an entire ecosystem of organisms is drummonized to exploit. Fungi spread their mycelial networks through the grain, secreting enzymes that break those molecular chains back down into simpler compounds they can absorb. Bacteria colonize the surfaces and the interior spaces, consuming whatever the fungi have pre-processed. Termites and other wood-boring insects chew through the structure physically, creating tunnels that let more organisms penetrate deeper. Even the wood itself, through internal chemical reactions, slowly oxidizes and breaks apart over time. It's a full-scale biological assault. Every molecule of energy in that log is a resource that something else wants to consume. And in most environments, the consumers win completely. In a typical temperate forest, a fallen tree will be almost entirely consumed within decades. The outer layers rot first, softening into a punky, waterlogged mass that slows away in chunks. Then the internal structure collapses as the lignin bonds dissolve. Within 50 to 100 years, what was once a solid oak trunk is reduced to a subtle depression in the forest floor, maybe a slight enrichment of the soil chemistry. Nothing visual remains, nothing structural, nothing that an archaeologist could identify as a specific object, let alone a constructed artifact. In tropical environments, the process is even faster. Heat and moisture accelerate every chemical reaction. Fungal growth is explosive. Insect activity is relentless. A log in a tropical rainforest might disappear in as little as 5 to 10 years. Even in dry environments where biological activity is slower, wood doesn't truly preserve. It desiccates, cracks, warps, and slowly fragmentizes under wind and thermal stress. Desert wood might last a few centuries, maybe a millennium under exceptional conditions, but eventually it erodes to dust too. The consumers always win. Time always wins. This is the central problem of what archaeologists call taphonomy, the science of what happens to organisms and objects after they die or are discarded. Taphonomy is the gatekeeper of the archaeological record, the filter that determines what survives to be found and what is erased forever. And that filter is mercilessly biased toward the durable. Stone survives, pottery survives, metal survives, at least partially, but bone survives under the right conditions, though it's far more fragile than stone. But wood, fibre, leather, cordage, basketry, textiles, all the materials that make up the bulk of daily human life in any pre-industrial society, those materials almost never survive beyond a few thousand years. The taphonomic filter deletes them. It writes them out of the historical record as thoroughly as a censor blacking out classified documents. What this means is that our understanding of ancient technology is fundamentally distorted. We see the stone tools, we find the butchered bones, we map the hearths and the living floors, but we're missing the entire soft technology layer. The wooden handles that made stone axes effective, the woven bags that carried gathered foods, the cordage that bound structures together, the carved bowls that held liquids, the sandals that protected feet, the baskets that stored grain. All of these things were essential to daily survival. All of them required sophisticated knowledge and skill to produce, and all of them are almost completely absent from the archaeological record before, about 10,000 years ago. We're reconstructing ancient societies from their garbage, the stone fragments and broken bones that couldn't rot away, while the actual tools of daily life, the things people made, used, and depended on every single day, have been erased by the very ecosystem those people lived within. Which brings us back to Kalambo Falls and the question that should be burning in your mind. How did this wood survive 476,000 years in a tropical African environment where decomposition should have consumed it within a decade? The answer is a specific, narrow, extraordinary set of environmental conditions that created what preservation scientists call a taphonomic window. A brief gap in the relentless filter of decomposition, a gap that opened at exactly the right moment and stayed open just long enough to save something that should have been lost forever. At Kalambo Falls, the preservation window was created by water. Not just any water. Standing, oxygen-poor, chemically distinctive water that saturated the sediment around the wooden structure almost immediately after it was built and maintained that saturation for an almost inconceivable length of time. Here's the mechanism. The Kalambo River cascades over a waterfall into a deep, sheltered basin. In that basin, the water slows, spreads out, and deposits fine sediment across the floodplain. When the wooden structure was built on that floodplain, probably right at the water's edge, where the builders could take advantage of the natural moisture and the straight, tall trees growing along the riverbanks, it occupied a position that was uniquely vulnerable to rapid burial. The river floods. It floods regularly, seasonally, driven by rainfall patterns that have probably been consistent in this region for hundreds of thousands of years. And when it floods, it doesn't just rise gently. It carries sediment, silt, clay, organic particles, and deposits them rapidly across everything in its path. So within weeks, maybe months of the structure being built, the first flood event buried the lower portions of those logs in fine, waterlogged sediment. This is the crucial first step. The sediment sealed the wood off from the air, and without air, without oxygen, the primary decomposers, the fungi and the aerobic bacteria that consume wood most efficiently, cannot function. They're suffocated. Their metabolic processes shut down. They die or go dormant. The wood is physically sealed in an anaerobic cocoon of mud and water. But anaerobic conditions alone aren't enough. There are anaerobic bacteria that can decompose wood too, though they work much more slowly. And chemical processes like hydrolysis can still break down cellulose over time, even without biological activity. What made Kalambo special was the specific chemistry of the water and sediment. The constant flow of the river, even during dry seasons, maintained a waterlogged environment that was not just oxygen-poor, but also slightly acidic and mineral-rich. This chemistry further inhibited the anaerobic decomposers, while simultaneously promoting the infiltration of minerals into the wood's cellular structure. Over millennia, the cellulose and lignin were partially replaced by mineral compounds, essentially fossilizing the wood from the inside out, while preserving its external form and structural details. The grain patterns, the tool marks, the shaped notches, all of these surface features were locked in place by the mineral replacement process, creating a kind of three-dimensional snapshot that survived even as the original organic material slowly degraded. This dual preservation mechanism, anaerobic isolation plus mineral infiltration, is extremely rare. It requires a precise combination of water chemistry, sediment type, burial speed, and long-term environmental stability that almost never occurs in nature. Most waterlogged environments are too oxygen-rich or too biologically active, or too chemically neutral to preserve wood for more than a few thousand years. Most rapid burial environments are too dry, or too alkaline, or too geologically unstable to maintain preservation over hundreds of millennia. Kalambo Falls hit the preservation jackpot, every variable aligned perfectly. The river deposited the right sediment at the right speed. The basin maintained the right water chemistry for the right duration. The geological context remained stable for nearly 500,000 years, protecting the buried structure from erosion, disturbance, or drainage. And against all statistical probability, that alignment held long enough to carry a constructed wooden artifact from the Middle Pleistocene all the way into the hands of 21st century archaeologists. This is why the Kalambo discovery is so uniquely valuable. It's not just that we found old wood, it's that we found wood that survived a preservation gauntlet that deletes 99.999% of all organic artifacts ever created by human hands. The taphonomic filter that has robbed us of the soft technology layer for our entire history as a discipline, that has forced us to reconstruct ancient societies from stone fragments while ignoring the wooden, woven and corded technologies that probably mattered more to daily survival. That filter cracked open at Kalambo Falls. Just once. Just enough. Just long enough to give us a glimpse of something we've been missing for generations. A constructed wooden structure, shaped logs, intentional notches, a working toolkit sitting right beside the construction site. Proof that 500,000 years ago, someone was building with wood in a way that required planning, skill, and coordinated effort. Proof that the soft technology layer existed long before we ever had evidence for it. Proof that our understanding of ancient technological capabilities has been fundamentally limited by the very processes that erase the evidence we need most. But Kalambo Falls isn't entirely alone in this. It is the oldest, the most complex, the most staggering, but it sits at the head of a growing line of wooden discoveries that have been forcing archaeologists to rethink their assumptions for decades. Each of these finds is a minor miracle of preservation. A brief window opened in that relentless taphonomic filter, and each one tells a story about ancient capabilities that stone tools alone could never reveal. Consider the Schöningen spears. In the 1990s, archaeologists working in an open-cast coal mine in Germany pulled something extraordinary from the sediment. 8 wooden spears, beautifully crafted, dated to around 300,000 years old. These weren't rough sticks, sharpened by chance. They were carefully shaped from spruce and pine, with their centres of gravity positioned precisely at the front third of the shaft, exactly where a javelin needs its weight for maximum range and impact. They were hunting weapons designed for throwing, engineered for flight. The craftsmen who made them understood balance, penetration, and the physics of a projectile moving through air. They planned these weapons, selected their materials with purpose, and executed the shaping with skill that any modern woodworker would recognize. And they left them beside a lake where they had been butchering horses, a scene frozen in time by the same kind of waterlogged anaerobic preservation that would later save the Kalambo structure. Then there are the finds at Poggetti Vecchi in Italy, dated to around 170,000 years ago. Wooden digging sticks, over 100 of them, recovered from a warm spring environment that preserved organic materials far beyond their normal lifespan. These sticks were made from boxwood, one of the hardest and most durable woods available in Europe. Their tips had been hardened by fire, a technique called fire hardening that involves carefully charring the working end of a wooden tool to compress and strengthen the cell structure. This isn't simple whacking a stick against a rock to break a tip. This is controlled application of heat to modify material properties. The people at Poggetti Vecchi understood that fire could transform wood into something tougher than its natural state. They were manipulating materials at a fundamental level. At Aranbalsa in Spain, researchers found wooden tools even more recent but equally revealing, around 90,000 years old. Neanderthal-made digging sticks and possible spear fragments, again preserved by waterlogged conditions, again showing careful selection and shaping of raw materials. These weren't improvised tools picked up and discarded on the spot. They were manufactured objects, created for specific purposes and carried to specific locations. They imply planning, foresight, and a working understanding of which wood served which functions. Each of these discoveries pushed the boundaries of what we thought ancient humans and their relatives could do. Each one added a piece to the puzzle of the lost soft technology layer. But here's what makes Kalambo Falls fundamentally different from all of them, and why it changes the story in a way that even Schöningen couldn't. The spears at Schöningen are weapons, individual tools, single objects made by single hands or small groups. Brilliant, yes. Engineered, absolutely. But they represent what we might call portable technology. Things you carry, things you use, things you can make in an afternoon and discard when they break. The digging sticks at Poggetti Vecchi and Aranbalsa fall into the same category. Essential tools, sophisticated in their construction, but fundamentally individual items. Kalambo Falls is something else entirely. It's a structure. Not a tool carried from place to place, but a construction fixed in space, made from multiple components fitted together according to a plan. Those shaped notches aren't decorative flourishes or convenient grips. They're joining features. They're engineering solutions to the problem of connecting separate pieces of wood into a larger, more stable whole. This implies a different kind of cognition entirely. Making a spear requires understanding properties of materials, balance, and projectile mechanics. But building a structure requires understanding load, stress, connection, and spatial relationships. You have to think in 3 dimensions. You have to coordinate multiple elements simultaneously. You have to hold a mental model of the finished product in your head while you're still in the middle of assembling it. And you probably have to coordinate with other builders, dividing tasks, sequencing operations, communicating about which piece goes where and in what order. The age gap matters too. Schöningen is 300,000 years old. Impressive, but a full 176,000 years younger than Kalambo. Poggetti Vecchi is younger still. Aranbalsa younger again. Kalambo Falls pushes the evidence for complex wooden technology back nearly 500,000 years into a period when we barely thought humans had the cognitive capacity for anything beyond basic stone flaking. It doesn't just add to the timeline, it blows the timeline open. And this growing collection of preserved wooden artifacts scattered across Europe and now Africa, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, all requiring similar underlying knowledge of material properties, shaping techniques, and functional design, suggests something that should make every archaeologist's pulse quicken. These finds aren't isolated inventions, independent breakthroughs that happened once and then faded. They're echoes, reverberations of a technology that was probably widespread, continuous, and constantly evolving. Each preserved example is just the surviving fragment of a much larger, much richer tradition that existed everywhere ancient humans and their relatives lived and worked. A tradition of wood shaping, wood joining, wood building that stretched back far beyond what any of these isolated discoveries can directly document. What we're seeing isn't the full picture, it's the tiny fraction that happened to fall into the rarest possible preservation windows. The real history of wooden technology is a vast, mostly invisible landscape that we're only just beginning to map. And Kalambo Falls is the oldest glimpse we've ever caught of that landscape. A glimpse that suggests the origins of construction, of engineering, of building itself may lie far deeper in our past than anyone imagined. So if this wasn't just a casual pile of logs, if it was a deliberately engineered structure with shaped notches and fitted joints, the question becomes unavoidable. What was it actually for? 500,000 years ago? Some being or group of beings invested serious time and energy into cutting, shaping, transporting, and assembling these logs. They had a purpose. They had a goal in mind. And we have to try to understand what that goal might have been, even if we can never know for certain. The most straightforward theory is the platform or walkway interpretation. Look at the environment where this structure was found. Kalambo Falls sits above a wetland, a marshy floodplain where the river spills out before plunging over the edge. The ground there wouldn't have been solid dry earth. It would have been soggy, unstable, seasonally flooded, the kind of terrain that sucks at your feet and slows your movement and makes every step a struggle. If you're trying to move across that landscape regularly, carrying resources, tracking game, moving between camps, you need a reliable path. A raised wooden walkway would solve that problem beautifully. It would keep you above the mud and water, provide stable footing, and create a fixed route through an otherwise treacherous environment. The notched joints connecting the logs would prevent the platform from shifting or separating underfoot, exactly the kind of engineering solution you'd need for a structure meant to support repeated passage. This theory has a lot going for it. It matches the local environment perfectly, explains the structural features logically, and requires a level of planning that seems achievable for early human species facing practical survival challenges. But maybe it was more than a walkway. Maybe those logs formed a foundation for something raised above the ground entirely. A dwelling, a shelter, some kind of elevated structure that kept its occupants dry and safe. This is the foundation theory, and it pushes the implications even further. If you're building a raised platform to support a hut or a windbreak or a sleeping area, you're not just solving a transportation problem. You're modifying your living space, you're creating architecture. You're deciding that the ground itself isn't good enough, and that you can improve your conditions by building something artificial between you and the earth. The notches and joints would be even more critical in this scenario, because a dwelling platform needs to bear continuous weight without collapsing. It needs stability over time, resistance to settling and shifting, the ability to hold together under the constant load of people sleeping, storing goods, and living their daily lives. This interpretation would make Kalambo Falls not just the oldest structure, but the oldest evidence of home building, the oldest trace of someone deciding to construct their own domestic space, rather than simply occupying whatever cave or rock shelter nature happened to provide. That's a profound shift in how we understand early human behaviour. But it also requires us to assume more. We don't have direct evidence of whatever might have sat on top of those logs. No remnants of walls, no traces of roofing materials, no post holes suggesting vertical supports for a superstructure. The wood itself might have been just the base layer of something more complex, but anything above it has vanished completely into the taphonomic void. We're left reading a foundation with no building, which means this theory remains plausible but hard to confirm. Then there's the storage platform theory. Maybe the structure wasn't meant for people to stand on at all, or at least not primarily. Maybe it was built to keep things off the ground. Food, tool materials, firewood, animal hides, whatever resources needed, protection from moisture, rot, insects and scavengers. In a wetland environment, keeping your supplies dry and elevated isn't a luxury, it's a survival necessity. Meat left on the ground spoils fast. Gathered plants wilt and degrade. Stone tool blanks wrapped in damp conditions can develop microfractures. A raised storage platform would solve all these problems simultaneously, creating a dry, stable surface where valuable resources could be kept safe until they were needed. This theory doesn't require the same level of architectural complexity as a dwelling foundation. It's more utilitarian, more focused on immediate practical needs. But it still demands planning, still demands the ability to shape and join logs, still demands forethought about what you'll need tomorrow and how to protect it today. And honestly, the line between a walkway and a storage platform might not have been clear to the builders themselves. These categories are ours, modern analytical frameworks imposed on ancient behaviour. The structure could have served multiple functions simultaneously, a path that also held supplies, a platform that people walked across, and also used for temporary storage. Ancient humans probably didn't compartmentalise their technology the way we do. But there's another possibility that's more intriguing and more specific to the Kalambo environment. What if the structure was part of a fish trap or water management system? The Kalambo River would have been a rich source of aquatic resources, fish, freshwater shellfish, maybe even water birds concentrated in the wetland areas. Building wooden structures in or near water to channel, trap, or concentrate fish is a technology that appears in many later cultures around the world. Weirs, traps, dam-like constructions designed to make aquatic harvesting more efficient and reliable. If the Kalambo structure was part of something like this, it would represent not just construction, but hydraulic engineering, the manipulation of water flow for practical benefit. The notched joints would make sense here too, because a structure sitting in moving water needs to resist currents, pressure, and the constant push and pull of a living river. Loose logs would be swept away. Fitted and joined logs would hold their position, maintaining whatever channel or trap shape the builders intended. This theory is fascinating because it connects the structure directly to subsistence strategy, to how these early humans were actually feeding themselves. It suggests they understood not just wood and joining, but water behaviour, flow dynamics, and the movement patterns of aquatic animals. That's a sophisticated ecological knowledge base, far beyond what we typically attribute to species living 500,000 years ago. But every one of these theories has limitations, and we need to be honest about them. The walkway theory is simple and elegant, but we only have a fragment of the structure. We can't see where it started or ended, can't trace its full path across the landscape, can't confirm it actually connected 2 points the way a walkway should. The dwelling foundation theory is compelling, but requires us to assume something existed that we have zero direct evidence for. The storage platform theory makes practical sense, but might be underestimating the ambition and complexity of the builders. And the fish trap theory, while exciting, relies heavily on the structure's proximity to water, which proves proximity but not purpose. The same location that makes a fish trap plausible also makes a walkway or a dwelling platform equally plausible. Being near water doesn't tell us why they built there, it just tells us they built there, which could mean almost anything. The truth is, we may never know for certain what this structure was meant to accomplish. The fragment we have is a window, but it's a narrow one, showing us just a few joined logs in a specific place at a specific time, without the broader context that would reveal its full function. The rest of the story, the purpose, the complete shape, the builder's intentions, has been lost to 500,000 years of decay, erosion, and geological transformation. We can propose theories, weigh evidence, argue for the most plausible interpretations, but we cannot reach back across that vast temporal gulf and read the minds of the creatures who shaped those notches. Their reasons are as vanished as the rest of their wooden world. And that uncertainty, that permanent gap in our knowledge, isn't a failure of science. It's a reminder of how much we don't know, how much we can never know about the deep past. The structure stands at the edge of our understanding, challenging us to think harder, imagine more carefully, and accept that some answers simply aren't available anymore. But even without knowing its purpose, we can still recognize what its existence implies about the minds that created it. And that's where this discovery shifts from an archaeological curiosity to something that fundamentally challenges how we understand early human cognition. Because those notches, those deliberate cut marks shaping two logs to fit together, they're not just physical features carved into wood. They're the fossilized remnants of a thought process. They're evidence that something was happening inside a mind 500,000 years ago that we rarely attribute to anything before our own species. Think about what deliberate notching actually requires. You don't just wake up one morning, pick up a tool and instinctively cut a notch into a log. You have to conceive of the notch before you make it. You have to imagine two separate pieces of wood connecting together in a way that they couldn't achieve on their own. You have to understand that removing material from one log and removing matching material from another will create an interlocking shape when the two are brought together. That's abstract reasoning. That's spatial visualization. That's the ability to hold a mental image of a finished product that doesn't exist yet, and then execute a series of physical actions to bring that image into reality. This is forethought on a level that's staggering for something living 500 millennia ago. And forethought doesn't stop at the mental design phase. The entire construction process implies a chain of planned actions stretching across time. First, you need to select appropriate trees. Not any log will work. You need wood of the right size, the right shape, the right condition. Then you need to fell those trees or find already fallen timber that meets your specifications. Then you need to transport those heavy logs to your construction site, which in a wetland environment means dragging massive weight through mud and water. Then you need to shape them, which means multiple cutting strokes with stone tools, each one requiring force, precision, and intention. Then you need to assemble them, fitting the notches together, adjusting if the fit isn't perfect, securing the joint so it won't slip apart. Each step depends on the previous one. Each step requires remembering the goal. Each step demands that the builder maintain focus across what could have been hours or even days of sustained effort. This isn't opportunistic behavior, grabbing a stick because you need it right now. This is delayed gratification. This is investing present labor for future benefit. And that implies a kind of temporal awareness, an understanding that actions today can produce results tomorrow, that seems far beyond what we've typically credited to archaic hominins. Then there's the question of hands, not metaphorical hands, actual hands. How many individuals did this project require? Moving large logs across difficult terrain isn't a solo activity. Even if one person designed the structure and cut the notches, the physical labor of transport and assembly almost certainly needed multiple participants. And that means coordination. Not just coordination in the simple sense of several creatures happening to pull the same log in the same direction, but coordination in the cognitive sense. Individuals understanding their roles within a shared task, following a common plan, contributing their effort toward a collective goal. Cooperative building suggests social organization that goes beyond simple group living. Many animals live in groups, few build things together. Cooperative construction requires trust, reliability, the expectation that your partners will actually do what they're supposed to do. It requires communication, whether through gestures, vocalizations, or some proto-language, to assign tasks, solve problems, and maintain group focus. It requires a social structure capable of organizing labor, deciding who does what, resolving conflicts, and distributing whatever benefits the finished structure provides. When those beings at Kalambo Falls cut those notches and fitted those logs, they may have been demonstrating not just individual intelligence, but collective intelligence, the ability of a group to think and act together toward a shared purpose. Compare this to what we know about other archaic hominin behaviors, from the same era. Stone tool-making demonstrates planning and skill, but it's an individual activity. One person, one rock, one finished tool. The cognitive requirements are real but contained. Fire use shows foresight and control, but again, it's something a single individual or a small group can manage without elaborate coordination. Even big game hunting, which some hominin species were definitely practicing by this point, requires group coordination, but it's reactive coordination, responding to an animal's movements in real time, not planned coordination executing a predetermined design over an extended period. The Kalambo structure implies something different, something more architectural, more sequential, more collaborative. It sits at a different tier of cognitive complexity than the behaviours we've used to define archaic hominin capabilities for decades. Which raises a question we can't answer yet, but can't stop asking. Does this structure represent a broader cognitive leap happening around this time? A threshold being crossed in multiple populations, multiple species, as brains grew and social networks expanded? Or is it an isolated achievement, a single group, or even a single exceptional individual pushing beyond what their species typically accomplished, leaving behind evidence of an outlier rather than a norm? We don't know, but the fact that the question exists, the fact that we're now forced to wonder whether 500,000 years ago something was already thinking in ways we've reserved for much later humans, tells you how much this discovery has shaken the foundations of our understanding. So those notched logs at Kalambo Falls weren't just an isolated trick. They were part of a broader technological awakening happening across the ancient world. And to really understand what was going on 500,000 years ago, you have to zoom out and look at the full picture, because woodworking wasn't the only innovation transforming how these beings survived. Take fire. We tend to think of controlled fire use as something that came late in human evolution, a hallmark of modern humans sitting around a campfire telling stories. But the evidence tells a different story. Archaeological sites from this same general time period show signs that hominins were not just opportunistically grabbing burning branches after lightning strikes. They were managing fire, maintaining it, transporting it. Sites like Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, dating to around 790,000 years ago, contain concentrated patches of burned flint, seeds, and wood that suggest repeated, controlled burning in specific locations. Not wildfires sweeping through the landscape, but contained, deliberate fire use. This matters because fire management requires the same kind of forethought we just saw in those notched logs. You have to collect fuel before you need it. You have to protect flames from wind and rain. You have to know which woods burn longest, which ones spark dangerously, which ones produce smoke that signals your position to predators. And you have to pass that knowledge on because fire doesn't teach itself. Then there's shelter. We've found traces of early campsite organisation that go way back. At Terra Amata in southern France, a site dating to roughly 380,000 years ago, researchers identified what appear to be deliberate arrangements of stones marking the outlines of oval-shaped shelters roughly 8 to 15 metres long, with hearths positioned inside them in consistent locations. The interpretation is debated. Some archaeologists argue these could be natural formations rather than intentional constructions, but the pattern repeats across multiple occupation layers at the site, which suggests something more than coincidence. Even if we're cautious about calling these definitive structures, the evidence points toward beings who were organizing their living spaces, choosing where to sleep, where to cook, where to work on tools, in ways that imply spatial planning and habitual routine. And then there are the materials we almost never see. The ones that rot away completely, leaving no trace after a few thousand years. Animal hides, plant fibres, bark strips, sinew, Any being capable of cutting precise notches into logs was almost certainly working with softer, more flexible materials too. They would have needed cordage to bind things together, to carry loads, to fasten hides to frames. Making rope or string from plant fibers requires knowledge of which plants yield strong, flexible strands, how to harvest and process them, and how to twist or braid them together to increase their strength. It's a sophisticated technology that we barely detect in the archaeological record because fibers decompose rapidly, but it's almost certain that these beings were using it. Because you don't build with wood without also binding, wrapping, and tying. The notched logs are just the piece that happened to survive. Put all of this together, and a picture of archaic hominin daily life starts emerging that's far more complex than the old stereotype of grunting brutes huddled in caves waiting for evolution to catch up. These beings were managing fire for warmth, cooking, and protection. They were processing plant materials for cordage and containers. They were potentially constructing shelters from wood, hides, and thatch. They were shaping logs with precision tools to fit together in interlocking joints. They were organizing their campsites with what looks like deliberate spatial logic. Each technology supports the others. Fire lets you work wood more easily by hardening points and drying timber. Cordage lets you bind shelter frames and carry construction materials. Shelters let you store tools, protect food supplies, and create stable environments for children and elders. This isn't a random collection of survival tricks. This is an integrated technological system, and Kalambo Falls fits right into this pattern. The wetland environment would have provided abundant materials for every part of this toolkit: reeds and rushes for cordage, clay for hearth construction, timber for building, fish and water resources for reliable food. It was exactly the kind of place where all these technologies could come together, where beings with this integrated skill set could thrive and innovate. The notched logs aren't some freak occurrence that appeared out of nowhere. They're what we should actually expect if hominins at this time were operating with this kind of broader technological capacity. The surprise isn't that someone built with wood 500,000 years ago. The surprise is that we've been so blind to the evidence that they could. What we're looking at isn't a single clever trick. It's an entire way of life that we've been underestimating for generations. The woodworking at Kalambo Falls was probably just one component of a much larger, much more sophisticated technological repertoire that these beings carried with them across their landscapes, refined over lifetimes, and passed down through lineages we can barely trace. And the more we look, the more we find hints of that repertoire scattered across the ancient world. But all of that integrated technology, the fire management, the cordage, the spatial planning, the precision woodworking, raises a question that makes archaeologists and linguists extremely uncomfortable. A question that sits right at the edge of what we can know about beings who lived 500,000 years ago. Did they need language to build this? We're not talking about simple grunts and gestures here. Every primate can communicate basic warnings, food calls, threat displays. That kind of signalling doesn't require anything special. But the notched logs at Kalambo Falls represent something fundamentally different. This was coordinated construction. Someone had to select appropriate trees, cut them to specific lengths, shape notches to precise dimensions, and then fit those notches together so they interlocked correctly. That sequence of actions has to be executed in the right order, with the right timing, and with shared understanding of what the finished product should look like. Try building even the simplest interlocking structure with 3 other people using only pointing, grunting, and facial expressions. You'll quickly discover that coordination without shared vocabulary is brutally difficult. Misunderstandings multiply, pieces get cut wrong, the whole project collapses into frustration. This is where the debate gets heated. Some researchers argue that the kind of collaborative engineering we see at Kalambo Falls almost certainly implies some form of verbal communication, Maybe not full modern language with recursive grammar and abstract storytelling, but something beyond gestural signalling. They point to what's called the scaffolding problem. Complex tasks require instructional scaffolding, the ability to break a process into steps, communicate those steps to others, and verify that they understand before proceeding. You can't scaffold construction through mime alone. Not when precision matters. Not when the pieces have to fit together in specific ways. The argument is that beings capable of this kind of coordination must have possessed at least a proto-languages, a system of shared vocal symbols that could reference objects, actions, and spatial relationships. But other scientists push back hard against this reasoning. They argue that we're making a huge logical leap from one wooden structure to an entire linguistic capacity. Bees construct elaborate hives through coordinated action without anything resembling language. Weaver birds build intricate communal nests through instinctive behavioral patterns. Even modern chimpanzees engage in coordinated hunting that requires some degree of shared attention and role differentiation, all without symbolic communication. The skeptics point out that you can achieve remarkable coordination through what's called embodied cognition, knowledge that lives in the hands and body rather than in verbal instructions. A skilled carpenter can teach an apprentice through demonstration and guided practice without ever explaining the theory behind why joints fit together. The learning happens through doing, through watching, through feel. Maybe the builders at Kalambo Falls operated the same way. Then there's the question of symbolic thought, which most linguists consider a prerequisite for true language. Symbolic thought means the ability to understand that one thing can stand for another thing, that a spoken sound can represent an object, that a marking can convey meaning beyond its physical form. The evidence for symbolic thought in hominins living 500,000 years ago is thin at best. We don't see clear symbolic artifacts from this period, no engraved patterns, no decorative objects, no evidence of ritual behavior that would imply abstract representation. Without symbolism, the skeptics argue, you can't have language, and without language, you can't have coordinated construction that requires verbal planning. Therefore, either the construction wasn't as coordinated as we're imagining, or there are forms of coordination we don't yet understand that don't require symbolic communication. But here's where the tool complexity enters the conversation, and it complicates both sides of the debate. The stone tools found at Kalambo Falls alongside the wooden structure aren't simple flakes. They're manufactured through multi-stage production sequences that require planning, spatial reasoning, and sequential logic. You have to select the right raw material. You have to envision the final tool shape hidden inside the stone before you start cutting. You have to execute a series of precise removals in the correct order, because one wrong strike can ruin the entire piece. This kind of procedural thinking, the ability to hold a sequence of steps in mind and execute them correctly, shares deep cognitive architecture with language. Both require hierarchical organization. Both depend on combining discrete elements into structured wholes. Both demand what cognitive scientists call working memory capacity and sequential processing. The relationship between tool complexity and linguistic capacity isn't proven, but it's suggestive. Beings who could manufacture sophisticated stone tools through planned sequences might have possessed at least some of the cognitive groundwork that language requires. And that brings us to perhaps the most important caution in this entire discussion. We have one structure, one wooden construction preserved in one location under exceptional conditions. We're trying to infer the linguistic capabilities of an entire species, maybe multiple species, from a single archaeological find. That's a massive inferential leap, and most responsible researchers will tell you so explicitly. The structure tells us these beings could coordinate construction. It tells us they had precision woodworking skills. It tells us they possess tools capable of shaping timber. It does not directly tell us whether they talk to each other while doing it. Language doesn't fossilize. Words don't preserve. Grammar doesn't leave traces in sediment. We will never find a recording of archaic hominins discussing their building plans. The best we can do is infer from indirect evidence, and those inferences will always be contested. What the find at Kalambo Falls does, though, is force us to take the question seriously in a way we haven't before. Prior to this discovery, most researchers assumed that complex construction, the kind requiring interlocking joints and coordinated effort, was a hallmark of much later humans, beings who definitely possessed language. The wooden structure shatters that assumption. It shows us that the capacity for engineered building emerged much earlier than we thought, in beings whose linguistic abilities remain deeply uncertain. That disconnect is what makes this one of the most tantalizing open questions in human origins research today. Not whether these beings had language, because we can't answer that, but whether they could achieve this level of coordination without it. And if they could, what does that tell us about the relationship between language, cognition, and technology that we've been getting wrong all along? But whenever you stumble onto something this revolutionary, something that challenges everything we thought we knew, you have to expect pushback. And there has been plenty, not vicious academic warfare, not the kind of ego-driven turf battles that sometimes erupt in paleontology, but legitimate, necessary scientific skepticism from researchers who think we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because in archaeology, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the claim that hominins were building engineered wooden structures 500,000 years ago is about as extraordinary as it gets. The most persistent alternative explanation is probably the simplest one. What if the logs weren't arranged by human hands at all? What if they were deposited by natural processes, and we're just reading intentionality into random patterns? This is the flood deposition argument, and it's not as dismissive as it might sound at first. Kalambo Falls sits near a river that has been flowing, flooding, and reshaping its banks for hundreds of thousands of years. Rivers are incredibly powerful sorting mechanisms. They carry logs, branches, and debris downstream, depositing them in patterns that can look surprisingly deliberate. Logs get jammed against each other, interlocking in ways that mimic human construction. Floods can sweep entire trees into configurations that seem too orderly to be natural. So the question becomes, how do we distinguish between a structure built by intelligent hands and a pile of logs dumped by a prehistoric river? The researchers who made the discovery acknowledged this concern directly. They spent significant time analysing whether the log arrangements could have been produced by fluvial processes, water movement. Their argument rests on several observations. The logs are positioned perpendicular to the natural flow direction that the river would have followed during flood events. If water had deposited them, they would typically align parallel to current flow, like toothpicks caught in a stream, not crossed at right angles against it. The notches themselves show internal carving marks that correspond with the stone tools found at the site, marks that appear deliberate rather than abrasion from tumbling against rocks or other logs. And perhaps most importantly, the larger log shows a notch carved into its underside, a feature that would be virtually impossible to produce through natural weathering or water damage because it's protected from direct environmental exposure. Nature doesn't typically carve precise rectangular hollows into the bottoms of buried logs, but skeptics counter that we're still looking at a small sample size, and that unusual natural configurations can occur, especially over geological timescales, where millions of flood events create millions of opportunities for rare arrangements to develop by chance. Then there's the dating critique, which cuts closer to the methodological heart of the claim. The primary dating method used was luminescence dating, a technique that measures when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight or heat. It's a well-established method, but it has known limitations. Luminescence signals can be partially reset by environmental factors, groundwater chemistry, burial conditions, thermal fluctuations over millennia. Skeptics ask whether the margin of error on dates this old might be larger than reported. Could these logs actually be 300,000 years old, rather than 500,000? That would still be remarkable, but it would place them in a different archaeological context, potentially associated with different hominin species with more established tool traditions. The researchers respond that they used multiple dating methods at the same site, cross-referencing results to establish consistency. When different independent techniques converge on similar age ranges, confidence in the date increases substantially. But the skeptics' point about error margins isn't trivial. At these timescales, even small systematic errors in measurement can shift dates by tens of thousands of years, potentially moving the find from one archaeological period into another. This is exactly how peer review and replication function in archaeology, and it's worth understanding the process because it's different from how it works in experimental sciences. In chemistry or physics, you can replicate an experiment by running it again under identical conditions in your own laboratory. In archaeology, you often can't. The excavation at Kalambo Falls occurred at a specific location under specific conditions. The samples were collected once. The measurements were taken once. Other researchers can reanalyze the published data, review the methodology, question the interpretations, and visit the site to conduct their own independent dating on newly exposed material, but they can't recreate the original discovery. This means that archaeological peer review relies heavily on methodological scrutiny rather than experimental replication. Reviewers examine whether the techniques used were appropriate, whether the data analysis was sound, whether alternative explanations were adequately considered, and whether the conclusions follow logically from the evidence presented. The Kalambo Falls paper went through this process and was published in a top-tier journal, which means it survived rigorous review by independent experts. But publication isn't the end of scientific debate. It's the beginning now. The broader community gets to weigh in, challenge, refine, or confirm. So, where does the consensus currently stand? Most researchers in the field accept that something genuinely unusual happened at Kalambo Falls. The perpendicular log arrangement, the carved notch, the association with sophisticated stone tools. These factors together make the natural deposition explanation increasingly difficult to sustain. You'd need multiple rare natural events to coincide in exactly the right way, and statistical reasoning suggests that's improbable. However, acceptance of the general finding doesn't mean agreement on the specific interpretation. There's broad consensus that the logs represent deliberate human modification, but significant disagreement about what that modification implies. Some researchers think it could be a simple platform, maybe just a few logs laid across a wet area to keep feet dry, requiring coordination but not necessarily complex planning. Others argue that the notched interlocking joint suggests engineering knowledge that would have been transmitted across generations, implying cultural traditions of construction. The truth probably lies somewhere between these positions, but we don't have enough evidence to pin it down yet. And this is where the most important point about scientific skepticism emerges. Healthy skepticism doesn't undermine the significance of the Kalambo Falls discovery. It strengthens it. Every legitimate challenge forces the researchers to refine their arguments, gather more evidence, and consider possibilities they might have overlooked. Every alternative explanation that gets tested and ruled out makes the remaining explanation more robust. When skeptics question whether flood deposition could produce those log arrangements, and the researchers demonstrate why that scenario doesn't fit the physical evidence, the case for deliberate construction gets stronger, not weaker. When someone challenges the dating methodology, and the researchers show that multiple independent techniques converge on the same age range, the date becomes more reliable, not less. This is how science actually works, not through instant consensus, but through productive disagreement that gradually eliminates uncertainty. The researchers who made this discovery aren't asking anyone to accept their interpretation on faith. They're presenting evidence, methodology, and reasoning, then inviting the scientific community to tear it apart, find the weaknesses, propose alternatives. That process is ongoing right now. Future excavations at Kalambo Falls may uncover additional structures that confirm or complicate the initial findings. New dating techniques may refine the timeline. Other sites may preserve similar wooden constructions from the same period, providing the kind of comparative evidence that transforms single finds into patterns. None of this happens without skeptics demanding rigor at every step. The discovery at Kalambo Falls isn't weakened by debate. It's being forged by it, tested against every possible challenge until whatever survives that process is the closest thing to truth we can get. And that's exactly how it should be, because if this structure really does represent a fundamental shift in our understanding of ancient human capabilities, we need to be sure. Not hopeful, not excited, sure. The kind of sure that only comes from surviving every skeptical attack and emerging stronger on the other side. Here's the thing about the Kalambo Falls structure that really matters. The reason it sends tremors through the entire field of human origins research. It's not just that someone built something with wood 500,000 years ago. It's that this discovery fits into a pattern that's been emerging for decades now, a pattern that keeps pushing back the dates for human innovation, keeps making our ancestors look smarter earlier, keeps forcing us to abandon the comfortable narratives we've told ourselves about how we became who we are. Every generation of archaeologists thinks they've finally pinned down the timeline, finally identified the moment when humans crossed some critical threshold into true intelligence. And every generation gets proven wrong. Remember when we thought symbolic thinking only emerged around 40,000 years ago? The so-called cognitive revolution that made modern humans truly modern. That entire framework was built on European evidence, cave paintings and carved figurines that seemed to appear suddenly in the archaeological record, like someone flipped a switch in the human brain. But then researchers started finding older evidence in other places. Lombo's cave in South Africa yielded engraved ochre pieces dating back 77,000 years. Shell beads from the same region pushed decorative expression back even further. Cave paintings in Indonesia turned out to be at least 45,000 years old, possibly much older, suggesting symbolic art wasn't a European invention, but a deeply ancient human capability that had simply been preserved differently in different environments. The cognitive revolution wasn't a revolution at all. It was a preservation bias, a mirage created by the fact that some environments protect archaeological evidence better than others. The same thing keeps happening with technology. We used to think complex stone tool manufacturing was a hallmark of modern humans, something that set us apart from all those primitive earlier species. Then we discovered that Neanderthals were making sophisticated hafted weapons hundreds of thousands of years ago. We realized that some stone tool traditions from far earlier periods required precisely the same kind of planning and abstract reasoning that we'd attributed exclusively to our own species. The boundary between modern and primitive kept shifting, kept blurring until it became increasingly unclear whether the boundary even existed in any meaningful sense. And now Kalambo Falls pushes the pattern even further. Because whoever built this structure, whether it was Homo heidelbergensis or some other hominin, we haven't even identified yet. They weren't just making tools. They were engineering. They were taking raw materials, modifying them with precise techniques, combining them into functional assemblies that serve purposes beyond immediate survival. This isn't the kind of innovation you can explain through accidental discovery or simple trial and error. This requires planning, spatial reasoning, understanding how components fit together to achieve structural integrity. This requires the kind of mental toolkit we've always assumed only emerged much later in the human story. But the Kalambo Falls discovery also points towards something even more profound, something that challenges the fundamental framework most of us grew up learning. The traditional view of human evolution looks like a ladder, a progressive climb from primitive ancestors to sophisticated modern humans. Each species a little smarter than the last, each technological tradition a little more complex, building steadily toward the pinnacle represented by us. It's a comforting narrative because it puts Homo sapiens at the top of a natural hierarchy, the inevitable outcome of millions of years of gradual improvement. We're the end point, the destination, the species that all that evolutionary striving was building toward. The problem is that this ladder of progress model has been falling apart for decades, and discoveries like Kalambo Falls might finally bury it completely. Because what we're increasingly finding is that technological innovation wasn't a linear progression. It was scattered, distributed, sometimes appearing in species we've traditionally considered primitive, sometimes disappearing for long periods before reappearing in different forms. The same basic capabilities, tool making, fire control, construction, even symbolic expression, seem to have emerged independently in multiple hominin lineages at different times and places. This suggests something that the ladder model can't accommodate. That sophisticated cognition wasn't the exclusive property of one evolutionary path leading to us. It was a potential that existed across multiple human species, expressed when conditions favoured it, suppressed when conditions didn't. Think about what that means. If Homo heidelbergensis or one of their contemporaries could engineer wooden structures 500,000 years ago, they weren't just a rough draft of modern humanity. They were fully realised intelligent beings operating within their own cultural traditions, solving problems with their own cognitive resources, creating technologies suited to their own needs and environments. They weren't waiting to evolve into us. They were living their own stories, developing their own innovations, building their own worlds. And they weren't alone. The archaeological record increasingly suggests that other hominin species were doing similar things in different parts of the world at roughly the same time. Not because they learned from each other, though that might have happened too, but because the capacity for innovation was widely shared among human species. Multiple minds reaching similar conclusions, finding similar solutions to the challenges of survival. This doesn't mean all human species were equally intelligent or equally innovative. There were real differences in cognitive abilities, technological traditions, and cultural complexity between different hominins. But the differences were matters of degree, not kind. The gap between Homo heidelbergensis and Homo sapiens wasn't the chasm between primitive and modern that we've often imagined. It was more like the gap between different cultures of innovative problem solvers, some more developed than others, but all operating with fundamentally similar cognitive hardware. So what comes next? The Kalambo Falls discovery isn't an endpoint. It's an opening. A signal that there's far more waiting to be found if we look in the right places with the right techniques. Future excavations at Kalambo may uncover additional structures, older ones, more complex ones, constructions that push the timeline back even further. The site has been preserving evidence for hundreds of thousands of years. We've barely scratched the surface of what might be buried in those waterlogged sediments. And other sites around the world might preserve similar evidence if we start looking for it with the expectation that it exists, rather than the assumption that it can't. Archaeologists have traditionally focused on stone tools because stone survives. Wood, bone, plant materials, most organic technologies decay beyond recognition within decades or centuries under normal conditions. We've built our understanding of ancient human capabilities primarily on the small fraction of their toolkit that happened to be made from durable materials. But the Kalambo Falls structure survived because of exceptional preservation conditions, waterlogged sediments that prevented decay for unimaginable spans of time. How many other exceptional preservation environments exist that we haven't explored yet? How many wooden structures, fiber artifacts, plant-based technologies have been preserved in bogs, cave floors, underwater deposits, waiting to reshape our understanding just as dramatically? The honest answer is that we don't know. We can't know. The vast majority of human prehistory has left no trace that survived long enough for us to find it. Wooden structures like the one at Kalambo Falls probably weren't unique. They might have been common, built by multiple hominin species across Africa, Europe, and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before any of them happened to be preserved. The technologies we consider revolutionary when we find them, hofted tools, constructed shelters, controlled fire use, might have been invented and reinvented dozens of times, flourishing in some populations for generations before being lost when those groups died out or dispersed, leaving no archaeological trace except the rare exceptions that happened to fall into the right preservation conditions at the right moment. This means that what we see in the archaeological record isn't the full story of human innovation. It's a fractured, fragmentary glimpse, a collection of accidental survivals that dramatically underrepresents the actual complexity and richness of ancient human life. The Kalambo Falls structure isn't just an anomaly. It's a window into how much we've been missing, how much of our ancestors' creativity, intelligence, and capability has been erased by time, leaving us with an impoverished picture that makes them look simpler than they were. The ladder of progress model wasn't just wrong about the direction of human evolution. It was wrong about the amount of evidence available to reconstruct that evolution. We've been building theories of human origins on a foundation of missing data, assuming that absence of evidence meant evidence of absence, when really it just meant evidence of decay. The discovery at Kalambo Falls doesn't just add a new data point to the archaeological record. It fundamentally changes how we should interpret every other data point we have. If wooden structures were being built 500,000 years ago, what else were ancient hominins doing that we haven't found evidence of yet? What other technologies? What other cultural practices, what other cognitive achievements have been lost to preservation bias, waiting to be discovered in the rare environments that protect the fragile materials our ancestors actually worked with most often? The story of human origins isn't just being rewritten. It's being revealed as fundamentally incomplete, with the missing chapters potentially far more remarkable than the ones we've managed to read so far. So we come back to where we started. A structure made of wood, resting near Kalambo Falls, dated to 476,000 years ago. 2 logs intentionally cut, deliberately shaped, fitted together, and secured with a notch. Something built by hands that understood how pieces combine to create something stronger than the sum of its parts. Hands that belong to a species we can't even name with certainty, for reasons we can only guess at, in a world that has vanished almost completely from the Earth's memory. That's the mystery at the heart of this discovery, and it's a mystery that might never be fully solved. But the mystery itself is the point. It forces us to stop thinking about ancient hominins as primitive precursors, rough drafts bumbling their way toward eventual modernity. It demands that we recognize them as intelligent, capable beings, thinking and planning and building in their own right, their own contexts, their own worlds that were rich with technologies and traditions we've simply failed to preserve. This one surviving structure changes the entire story because it proves that the story was always incomplete. It shatters the assumption that absence of evidence means evidence of absence. It reminds us that our ancestors' real capabilities were far broader, far deeper, far more impressive than the fragmentary record we've reconstructed from stone and bone alone could ever show. And it invites us to wonder just how much more remains buried, waiting in waterlogged sediments, protected in cave floors, sealed beneath volcanic ash, ready to reshape our understanding once again. If you found yourself wondering about these same questions, leaning into the mystery of our deep shared past, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from right now. It's always incredible to see how far this community reaches across the world. And if you enjoyed this journey into prehistoric secrets, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss an exploration. If you want to dive even deeper into these ancient mysteries, I've written a book filled with more prehistoric secrets and wonders, and you can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. The story of human origins isn't finished being written. It's barely begun being uncovered. Every new discovery, every preserved fragment that survives against all odds, reminds us that the past was far more extraordinary than we ever imagined, and far more of it is still waiting, just beneath the surface, to change the story again.